For more moral, you must see this move for what it most often is. Not a reflection of morality, of right and wrong, but a clever strategy, an exterior maneuver. You can recognize an exterior maneuver in a number of ways. First, the moral attack often comes out of left field, having nothing to do with what you imagine the conflict is about. Something you have done in a completely different arena is dredged up as a way to drain your support or inject you with guilt. Second, the attack is often ad hominem. Rational argument is met with the emotional and personal. Your character, rather than the issue you are fighting over, becomes the ground of the debate. Your motives are questioned and given the darkest turn. Once you realize you are under attack by a moral warrior using the exterior maneuver, it is vital to keep control of your emotions. If you complain or lash out angrily, you just look defensive, as if you had something to hide. The moral warrior is being strategic. The only effective response is to be strategic too. Even if you know that your cause is just, you can never assume that the public sees it the same way. Appearances and reputation rule in today's world. Letting the enemy frame these things to its liking is akin to letting it take the most favorable position on the battlefield. Once the fight for moral terrain has begun, you must fight to occupy the high ground in the same way you would in a shooting war. Like any form of warfare, moral conflict has both offensive and defensive possibilities. When you are on the offense, you are actively working to destroy the enemy's reputation. Before and during the American Revolution, the great propagandist Samuel Adams took aim at England's reputation for being fair-minded, liberal, and civilized. He poked holes in this moral image by publicizing England's exploitation of the colony's resources and simultaneous exclusion of their people from democratic processes. The colonists had had a high opinion of the English, but not after Adams's relentless campaign. To succeed, Adams had to resort to exaggeration, picking out and emphasizing the cases in which the English were heavy-handed. His was not a balanced picture. He ignored the ways in which the English had treated the colonies rather well. His goal was not to be fair, but to spark a war, and he knew that the colonists would not fight unless they saw the war as just and the British as evil. In working to spoil your enemy's moral reputation, do not be subtle. Make your language and distinctions of good and evil as strong as possible. Speak in terms of black and white. It is hard to get people to fight for a gray area. Revealing your opponent's hypocrisies is perhaps the most lethal offensive weapon in the moral arsenal. People naturally hate hypocrites. This will work, however, only if the hypocrisy runs deep. It has to show up in their values. Few will care about some innocuous, self-contradictory comment made or vote taken long ago. But enemies who trumpet certain values as inherent to their side, yet who do not always adhere to those values in reality, make juicy targets. The Algerian and North Vietnamese propaganda campaigns were so destructive in part because of the discrepancy they were able to show between the values of freedom and liberty espoused by France and the United States, and the actions those countries were taking to squash national independence movements. Both nations seemed hypocritical. If a fight with your enemies is inevitable, always work to make them start it. In 1861, President Abraham Lincoln maneuvered carefully to make the South shoot first at Fort Sumter, initiating the Civil War. That put Lincoln on the moral high ground and won over many ambivalent Northerners to his side. Similarly, even if you are fighting a war of aggression, your goal to take from your enemy, find a way to present yourself not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. You are fighting not for land or money, but to free people suffering under an oppressive regime. In general, in a conflict that is potentially nasty, in which you are certain the enemy will resort to almost anything, it is best that you go on the offensive with your moral campaign and not wait for their attacks. Poking holes in the other side's reputation is easier than defending your own. The more you stay on the offensive, the more you can distract the public from your own deficiencies and faults are inevitable in war. If you are physically and militarily weaker than your enemy, all the more reason to mount an exterior maneuver. Move the battle to the moral terrain, where you can hamstring and beat a stronger foe. The best defense against moral warriors is to give them no target. Live up to your good name. Practice what you preach, at least in public. Ally yourself with the most just causes of the day. Make your opponents work so hard to undermine your reputation that they seem desperate, and their attacks blow up in their faces. If you have to do something nasty and not in harmony with your stated position or public image, use a cat's paw, some agent to act for you and hide your role in the action. If that is not possible, think ahead and plan a moral self-defense. At all costs, avoid actions that carry the taint of hypocrisy. A stain on your moral reputation can spread like an infection. As you scramble to repair the damage, you often inadvertently publicize the doubts it has opened up, which simply make things worse. So be prudent. The best defense against a moral attack is to have inoculated yourself against it beforehand, by recognizing where you may be vulnerable and taking preventative measures. When Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon and initiated the civil war against Pompey, he was highly vulnerable to the charge of trying to usurp the authority of the Roman Senate in order to become a dictator. He inoculated himself against these charges by acting mercifully toward his enemies in Rome, making important reforms, and going to the extreme in showing his respect for the Republic. By embracing some of the principles of his enemies, he kept their attempts at moral infection from spreading. Wars are most often fought out of self-interest. A nation goes to war to protect itself against an invading or potentially dangerous enemy, or to seize a neighbor's land or resources. Morality is sometimes a component in the decision, in a holy war or crusade, for example, but even here, self-interest usually plays a role. Morality is often just a cover for the desire for more territory, more riches, more power. During World War II, the Soviet Union became a beloved ally of the United States, playing a key role in the defeat of Hitler. But after the war, it became America's darkest enemy. American self-interest, not the Soviets, had changed. Wars of self-interest usually end when the winner's interests are satisfied. Wars of morality are often longer and bloodier. If the enemy is seen as evil, as the infidel, it must be annihilated before the war can end. Wars of morality also churn up uncontrollable emotions. Luther's moral campaign against Rome generated such hatred that in the subsequent invasion of the Holy City by the troops of Charles V in 1527, German soldiers went on a 6-month rampage against the church and its officials, committing many atrocities in what came to be known as the Sack of Rome. As in war, so in life. When you are involved in a conflict with another person or group, there is something you are fighting over, something each side wants. This could be money, power and position, on and on. Your interests are at stake, and there is no need to feel guilty about defending them. Such conflicts tend not to be too bloody. Most people are at least somewhat practical and see the point in preventing a war from going on too long. But those people who fight out of a moral sense can sometimes be the most dangerous. They may be hungry for power and are using morality as a cover. They may be motivated by some dark and hidden grievance, but in any case, they are after more than self-interest. Even if you beat them, or at least defend yourself against them successfully, discretion here may be the better part of valor. Avoid wars of morality if you can. They are not worth the time and dirty feelings they churn up. Reversal. The moral offensive has a built-in danger. If people can tell what you are doing, your righteous stance may disgust and alienate them. Unless you are facing a vicious enemy, it is best to use this strategy with a light touch and never seem shrill. Moral battles are for public consumption, and you must constantly gauge their effect, lowering or raising the heat accordingly. Here are further reflections on the righteous strategy. From The Mind of War, John Boyd and American Security, by Grant T. Hammond. Colonel John Boyd paid particular attention to the moral dimension and the effort to attack an adversary morally by showing the disjuncture between professed beliefs and deeds. The name of the game for a moral design for grand strategy is to use moral leverage to amplify one's spirit and strength, while exposing the flaws of competing adversary systems. In the process, one should influence the uncommitted, potential adversaries, and current adversaries so that they are drawn toward one's philosophy and are empathetic toward one's success. From Introduction to Strategy, by André Beaufra. The central feature of the exterior maneuver is to assure for oneself the maximum freedom of action, while at the same time paralyzing the enemy by a multitude of deterrent checks, somewhat as the Lilliputians tied up Gulliver. As with all operations designed to deter, action will of course be primarily psychological. Political, economic, diplomatic, and military measures will all be combined toward the same end. The procedures employed to achieve this deterrent effect range from the most subtle to the most brutal. Appeal will be made to the legal formulae of national and international law. Play will be made with moral and humanitarian susceptibilities, and there will be attempts to prick the enemy's conscience by making him doubtful of the justice of his cause. By these methods, opposition from some section of the enemy's internal public opinion will be roused, and at the same time some sector of international public opinion will be whipped up. The result will be a real moral coalition, and attempts will be made to co-opt the more unsophisticated sympathizers by arguments based upon their own preconceived ideas. This climate of opinion will be exploited at the United Nations, for instance, or at other international gatherings. Primarily, however, it will be used as a threat to prevent the enemy undertaking some particular action. It is a point worth noting that just as in military operations one captures a position on the ground and thereby denies it to the enemy, on the psychological plane it is possible to take over abstract positions and equally deny them to the other side. The leaders of the Soviet Union, for instance, have turned into their own preserve the peace platform, that of the abolition of atomic weapons, while themselves continuing to develop them, and that of anti-colonialism, while themselves ruling the only colonial empire still in existence. It may therefore be that these ideological positions occupied by the forces of Marxism may one day be conquered by the West, but this presupposes that the latter, in their indirect strategy, have learned the value of thinking and calculating instead of merely trying to apply juridical or moral principles which their enemy can use against them at every turn. From The Mind of War, John Boyd and American Security, by Grant T. Hammond. How should a regime pursue a counter-guerrilla campaign? Colonel John Boyd laid out an array of tools. Undermine the guerrillas' cause and destroy their cohesion by demonstrating integrity and competence of government to represent and serve the needs of the people rather than exploit and impoverish them for the benefit of a greedy elite. If you cannot realize such a political program, Boyd noted, you might consider changing sides now to avoid the rush later. Take political initiative to root out and visibly punish corruption. Select new leaders with recognized competence as well as popular appeal. Ensure that they deliver justice, eliminate major grievances, and connect the government with its grassroots. From Rules for Radicals, by Saul D. Alinsky. It is a world not of angels, but of angles. where men speak of moral principles, but act on power principles. A world where we are always moral and our enemies always immoral. The Concept of the Political by Carl Schmitt. Humanity as such cannot wage war because it has no enemy, at least not on this planet. The concept of humanity excludes the concept of the enemy because the enemy does not cease to be a human being, and hence there is no specific differentiation in that concept. That wars are waged in the name of humanity is not a contradiction of this simple truth. Quite the contrary, it has an especially intensive political meaning. When a state fights its political enemy in the name of humanity, it is not a war for the sake of humanity, but a war wherein a particular state seeks to usurp a universal concept against its military opponent. At the expense of its opponent, it tries to identify itself with humanity in the same way as one can misuse peace, justice, progress, and civilization in order to claim these as one's own and to deny the same to the enemy. The concept of humanity is an especially useful ideological instrument of imperialistic expansion, and in its ethical humanitarian form, it is a specific vehicle of economic imperialism. Here one is reminded of a somewhat modified expression of Proudhon's: whoever invokes humanity wants to cheat. To confiscate the word humanity, to invoke and monopolize such a term, probably has certain incalculable effects, such as denying the enemy the quality of being human and declaring him to be an outlaw of humanity. And a war can thereby be driven to the most extreme inhumanity. And lastly, by Thomas Hobbes. Successful wickedness hath obtained the name virtue when it is for the getting of the kingdom. Chapter 26. Deny them targets. The strategy of the void. The feeling of emptiness or void, silence, isolation, non-engagement with others, is for most people intolerable. As a human weakness, that fear offers fertile ground for a powerful strategy. Give your enemies no target to attack. Be dangerous, but elusive and invisible. Then watch as they chase you into the void. This is the essence of guerrilla warfare. Instead of frontal battles, deliver irritating but damaging side attacks and pinprick bites. Frustrated at their inability to use their strength against your vaporous campaign, your opponents will grow irrational and exhausted. Make your guerrilla war part of a grand political cause, a people's war, that crests in an irresistible revolution. The lure of the void. In 1807, Napoleon Bonaparte of France and Tsar Alexander I of Russia signed a treaty of alliance. Now the period's two great military powers were linked. But this treaty was unpopular with the Russian court. Among other things, it allowed Napoleon nearly free rein in Poland, Russia's traditional front yard. Russian aristocrats worked to influence the Tsar to repudiate it. Before too long, Alexander began to take actions that he knew would displease the French, and by August 1811, Napoleon had had enough. It was time to teach Russia a lesson. He began to lay plans for an invasion. The acquisition of this vast territory to the east would make him the ruler of the largest empire in history. Some of Napoleon's ministers warned him of the dangers of invading such a vast country, but the Emperor General felt supremely confident. The Russian army was undisciplined, and its officers were squabbling among themselves. Two forces in Lithuania were positioned to block an invasion from the west, but intelligence had revealed that they were unprepared. Napoleon would march into a central position between these forces and defeat them in detail. He would ensure victory by mobilizing an army 3 times larger than any he had previously led. 650,000 men would march into Russia, 450,000 as part of the main attack force, the rest to secure lines of communication and supply. With an army this size, he could dominate even the large spaces of Russia, overwhelming the feeble enemy not only with his usual brilliant maneuvers, but with superior firepower. Napoleon may have felt certain of victory, but he was not a reckless man. As always, he studied the situation from every angle. He knew, for instance, that Russian roads were notoriously bad. Local food supplies were meager. The climate tended to extremes of heat and cold, and the vast distances made it much harder to encircle the enemy. There was always room to retreat. He read up on the failed invasion of Russia by the King of Sweden, Charles XII, in 1709, and anticipated that the